Hi, everybody. My name is Jared Milrad. I'm the founder of Movie Karma. Really excited to be here for another episode of Rewriting Hollywood, where we focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, and social impact in Hollywood. And two incredible guests today on our podcast. They're part of the new project called Our American Family, which will be released in the U.S. theatrically in New York, as well as LA on September the 2nd, and on video on demand in the US and Canada on major platforms on September the 6th, which are both timed to National Recovery Month. I'm really excited today to have two guests from that project, Hallee Adelman and Sean King O'Grady, who directed and produced Our American Family. So really excited to have them both here. Sean, Hallee, thanks so much for being on our podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Let's dive right in. We don't have too much time with both of you. So, Hallee, we read you've taught elementary through university students. You're committed to bettering the lives of children and families through education, through story, and through film. Can you just tell us a little bit more about your background? How did your path kind of intersect with this project?
Well, that was great. You're right. You're right. Yes, I have a background as an educator. As a storyteller, I write as books, and then as a filmmaker as well. So for me, this was a marriage of just every piece of everything I've ever done kind of coming together. I was working on a teen novel where it was a sibling story, and one sibling was struggling with addiction and the other was not. And this woman from my town, Linda, who's the mother in Our American Family, came and said, "Hey, do you want to meet two of my kids and talk to them?" Her oldest daughter, Nicole, who you see in the film, was a chronic relapser, struggling with heroin addiction at that time, had started, with drinking and marijuana and progressed from there. And her youngest son, Steven, who had to pretend he was perfect all the time because there was a lot going on in the family.
Yeah, and it's really unflinching and honest look at the impacts, for those who haven't seen it, of addiction on family, on the entire family, really. And it follows this, as you alluded to, this really close-knit Philadelphia family that's dealing with generational substance abuse. So, Sean, I wanted to bring you in on this. We read yourself have a really incredible background, an award-winning feature producer and director. Your films have screened at top festivals like Sundance and Tribeca and Telluride. Tell us a little bit more about your background, Sean. How did you come to get involved in this project, but also just more broadly give us a sense of your work before that?
Well, so I was introduced to Hallee by a mutual friend who said, Hallee found this family. It might be a story. She thought there might be a documentary here that we could make. And so myself and some of my team flew to Philadelphia to meet Hallee and meet this family. We were thinking we were doing research. Hallee was thinking we were starting filming the movie that day. And so I'm thinking the whole time that day, like, oh, this is great. There's definitely a documentary here. We get to the end of the day and we filmed a bit, and Hallee was kind of like, why weren't we filming the whole time? Like, she knew. I was like, this is really great. And she's like, yeah, I told you it was great. I knew there was a story here. So I guess that's the introduction to this story. And it's interesting. I didn't know this when we started, but really this is like an intersection. This film became an intersection of like my two interests in film, and kind of what all the stories I want to tell are, which is I like to look at characters who are overcoming impossible odds, which we get to see happen here. And then I also like to look at stories where people are really confronting the nature of their own reality. And I think that, to me, what became clear while making this film is that addiction affects the lens at which you perceive your reality, and you can't truly be living to your fullest if that's a barrier there, a block, something keeping your lens blurry. So unknowingly, this was just like perfectly sitting at the intersection of the things that are my obsessions.
Really interesting. It does sort of discover and sort of unfold. We sort of experience that intersectionality through the project as you've created it as well. Hallee, let's talk a little bit about just the themes of the project, which you also alluded to a minute ago. But for folks who don't know, I'm sure many of our listeners have been impacted by addiction. But it's pretty staggering, the statistics, particularly in light of the pandemic. Where we know overdose deaths soared to record numbers. the opioid epidemic, of course, is now eclipsed deaths of car crashes. I mean, this is really an epidemic, of course, of high proportions. Can you just talk a little bit about some of the themes behind the project around addiction, and why did you feel like this moment or this particular story really stood out to you to tell?
Well, some of the themes that I think are really important for us, and that came out just so clearly. The first one is really just very driven by this family, which is the idea of what happens when you stop hiding addiction. You know, what happens when you say what's really challenging, you say what's going on. You know, only I think it's like 12% of people who are struggling with addiction even talk about the fact that they're struggling with addiction. So just the question, hanging the question of what happens when you are brave, maybe not to the degree of this family if that's not comfortable for you, but maybe within a circle that feels more comfortable for you. I think the other thing that hopefully we see, well, I know we see in this film, is really the underpinning, the emotional underpinnings. Like addiction might be a symptom, addiction might run through generations from, you know, different epigenetics and those pieces, but what are the emotional underpinnings of addiction? Really getting to the heart of us discussing. And even more importantly than that, hope, we really want families to find hope. The fact that Nicole, after 17 treatment centers, you know, at the end of this film was able to achieve long-term sobriety for the first time in her life and is now almost 5 years sober. To say to families, maybe we can shift from the talk about addiction to the talk about recovery, that there is hope, that there is possible. And then the fourth thing really is, you know, the other piece is the idea of how can we as a society start finding more compassion. You know, how can we see a family that's struggling and see it very intimately, thanks to, you know, the family and Sean and Seamus, our DP. How can we see a family so intimately, but then also say, can we find compassion instead of judgment?
Yeah, I love that. We could definitely use more compassion for sure, instead of judgment. Absolutely. Sean, I wanted to bring you in this in terms of just building on what Hallee was saying around, you know, particularly the idea of talking about addiction openly. We see that, as Hallee mentioned in the film, with the family being very open about talking about the challenges that they're facing, calling it what it is essentially, and then publicly even talking about it in their community and trying to help others. Could you expand on that? You know, did you feel like that was an important theme to unpack, or what other themes were important to you?
Yeah, I think so. I think that the vulnerability that the family was willing to share with us as filmmakers and ultimately with an audience is really something special and kind of unseen before. I think that also the fact that, you know, this wasn't a film about active addiction, this was a film about recovery. We don't see that either. Like, I was able to experience things and witness things through making this film that I'd never seen before, that I'd never experienced before. And knowing that they were brave enough to share that, I think for us, it really made us committed to making sure that we were telling this story the right way and that we were going to be able to impact audiences the way that it was impacting us.
And I wanted to build on that as well, Hallee. What has the impact been? I mean, I know you've been obviously screening this, and it's getting ready to go to its wide release as we speak. But what has the impact been thus far in terms of folks who've watched it, either among those who've been struggling with addiction in their families, or others who are, you know, kind of learning about this topic through the film?
Well, people are definitely reaching out and saying thank you. Like, thanks for, whether it's giving me the insight of what it looks like to be, you know, it's funny because a lot of times people that are reaching out, not only there are families that reach out that are struggling with addiction, but then there's also families like where, you know, we see in the film, Our American Family, that, you know, Linda's the grandmom raising her granddaughter. You know, there are families that, whether it's addiction or something else, are trying to unpack, what does that look like? How can you sensitively raise your grandchild when your daughter is in the picture and cares deeply about her daughter, and things are, uncomfortable? How can you be a child in a family who has to feels like you have to stay silent all the time, or feels like we see Steven say in the film that the biggest thing in their lives is more important than anything he could bring to the table. Even when he was telling us a story, even when he was like, found out he was president of his class, and he wrote it in high school, like how to keep quiet. So I think really looking at the different pieces that the family members are bringing to the table, that creates a response. Families are saying like, wow, I have someone in my family that's struggling and I feel overshadowed, or I have someone in my family that's struggling and I'm deeply resentful. And I know they're trying to get better and they're doing better, but like, we're frustrated. And that's why one of the reasons we've actually partnered with the Heron Project to make sure that anybody who views our film has a specific place they can call. And we're also gathering other really trusted resources for people to be able to reach out to. It was really important to us that before our theatrical and on demand, and before we went to AMC Plus in October, that viewers can feel supported. And hopefully, the reach outs, if they're a small indication of what's coming when, this is more broadly available, then we're excited to say to audience members, like there are resources that are vetted and trusted that you can reach out to.
Yeah, I love that. I hope that's one of the impacts for sure of this. Sean, I'll give you one of the last words in a couple minutes left, but could you, if you wanted to build on that, just in terms of what the impact that you've received from audiences for this project, or that you hope folks will take away from watching
it? I think for me, it's really, if this can be an empathy engine and have people who, I think in maybe all over the world, but in our country specifically, I don't think there's anyone who isn't touched by addiction in some way, shape, or form. But I think everyone thinks it's something that they're dealing with and that nobody else is dealing with. Even though you see the statistics, it's very different. Statistics tell one story, a human story tells another story. And I think that hopefully through the bravery of this family and seeing what they were willing to share, other people will be willing to either face what's happening with them and know that there can be hope. Like, this is a hopeful story, which is crazy. Like, we're so trained as audiences with, whether it's through sports documentaries or through addiction documentaries, like, something bad is coming at the end, that we're going to have to learn through failure. And that's not the case here. So hopefully, this can, I guess, two things really that I want audiences to take away is really empathy and hope.
Yeah, beautifully said. Hallee, I'll give you the last word here, building on that notion of empathy and hope. You mentioned, folks being more aware of resources and tools that they can use if they are struggling with addiction or know someone who is in their family or among their friends. What do you think, if you could build on that, like, what is your hope in terms of where treatment for addiction will head, or this conversation around addiction will head? Because I wonder, are we at a turning point? And because this has gone, especially opioid addiction has gone so far out of control, affected so many families, it does seem like even in Congress there's some bipartisan agreement that we should do something, which is rare. What are your thoughts in terms of the hope of where this can go, and at least in the United States?
Well, I think for me, who cares deeply about our next gen, the hope really is about how can we talk also about the emotional underpinnings of not just addiction, but with what our society's struggling with. Like, we have a next gen who is feeling kind of broken right now, whether it's from like like the dark side of social media, or whether it's from, not being social as much as previous generations, not connecting as much, whether it's from our parenting style nowadays. Like, no matter what it's from, we have a generation that needs to be heard, and we have a generation that needs to be healed. So for me, if we can show people that when you remove stigma and when you deeply start by, at the very least, being honest, that we can hopefully find change together.
I love that. Thank you again to our guests today, Hallee, Sean. Again, the project is called Our American Family. It's a really powerful documentary. I hope folks will check it out when it's available very soon. Again, thanks so much, Hallee and Sean, for being on the podcast. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.